This episode of the New Medical Nomads podcast is brought to you by Nomadicare. Now, personally, I love Nomadicare. I've used Nomadicare, and I recommend the company to all new travelers. What Nomadicare does is it takes the fear out of getting set up with a bad recruiter, which is the biggest fear that you have jumping into this journey. So they sit down, they interview recruiters, they vet them, get them on a list, and then provide them to you as a free service, as a free recruiter matchmaking service in order to get you started on your journey. Now, usually you only get 2 recruiters going through Nomadicare, but being a listener of the show, you can get 3. So this is how it's going to work. You go to nomadicare.com/Dylan. You will get set up with 3 recruiters to be on your dream team, as well as a guide to get you started on your journey.
Hey Nomads, this is Dylan Callier coming at you from San Pablo Bay. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the New Medical Nomads podcast. I am your host, Dr. Dylan Callier, and today we are diving in and talking about Airbnb. Airbnb is what I used to find my first housing situation, my first housing ever when I took that very first contract. And there was a steep learning curve with it, and so I want to dive into the nitty-gritty with using Airbnb. What I will start out with is that this was surprisingly the most stressful part for me throughout the entire first contract. The negotiations, finding recruiters, getting submitted, doing the interview. This housing part was the most stressful for me. And I think where I went wrong is that I was trying to play the game of submitting to a bunch of different places, finding pricing for a house, and then using, pricing A or person A for their pricing situation, and then using that as leverage for pricing B to get person B to come down on theirs. And then I would take the person B's price and then I would go towards person A. And I was basically working back and forth to see who I could get the lowest. Well, what ended up happening is that person A ended up backing out last minute after I was basically committed with them. And they said, you know what, actually, I redid the calculations. It's not going to work out. Sorry. And so I was like, oh, shoot. Well, I'll go back to person B. Well, I went back to person B, and they had already been talking with somebody else trying to get them in for their housing situation. So I was like, oh, no. So now I lost out on both, and I was going to get stuck in this super expensive situation. And luckily, person B ended up coming through, and they wanted somebody who was going to be there longer versus the other individual they were talking to who would have only been there for a week or 2. But that was the most stressful part. And I think moving ahead, what would be best is just knowing what a good deal in that area is. That way, when you come across it, you don't have to bounce around. You don't have to feel sleazy, and you just take the opportunity when it presents itself. And so that is what I'm doing from now on. I don't like being in that situation where you're trying to almost use people against each other. Some people might say that's just part of negotiations, but I don't feel the best doing that. And I almost lost cheap housing doing so. So from moving forward, that's how I'm going to handle these situations. But Airbnb, I wanted to talk about the 3 top things that I learned. And some things were surprising. Some things I think you guys can definitely benefit from. So the first thing I learned about Airbnb is that when they price themselves, that is not including the Airbnb charge. And that was very surprising to me. I hadn't used Airbnb before. And so when I went in and bought my first housing, I went in and came out, and then all of a sudden my bill was higher than what was quoted me. And so it was an extra $300 to $400 in order for me to live there using Airbnb. And so that was a bit of a surprise. So know going in that when you have the Airbnb, that you are going to be charged the Airbnb fee after the quoted price. The second thing that I learned using Airbnb is that if you see somewhere that you're interested in, message them. Even if you're traveling with a dog and they say no dogs, even if they have something in the rules that doesn't align with what your situation is, message them anyhow. Usually if they find out that the person is a contractor willing to stay for 3 months, that they will start to bend the rules. And so you can message them and be like, hey, I have this dog, but it's a very small dog and she's great. She's amazing. You can ask previous places I've stayed that they use, and you basically tell them that the dog's awesome, and then they'd be a little more comfortable with allowing a dog to come in. That way it's not chewing up everything and chewing up the apartment, which is ultimately what they are worried about. I don't travel with puppies, unfortunately, but that is something that you can do if you are planning on traveling with a dog or traveling with a pet. So the other thing about messaging everybody is not only to kind of really see what their rules are, because you might be able to get a really good deal in a place that you would have normally excluded just because the rules said so, but you get a feel for everybody. And so message everyone. If you get a weird feeling or they're not being very responsive with their messages, and you can usually get a really good idea of who the person is going to be that you'll be living with through the messaging. So some Airbnb hosts might come off very eccentric and very strange, or they might be brash and rude. And if that's the case and that's how they're messaging, that's not a good sign. That might not be somebody that you want to be living with for 3 months. And so message everybody, get a feel for who they are, and then you can move forward from there. Another option that you can do is, after messaging back and forth, once you have it narrowed down to maybe 2 or 3 places that you're really interested in living, you can offer to be contacted outside of the app. So I am very easily findable using Google. So I give them my full name, because Airbnb will not allow you to put in your phone number, and it will not allow you to put in a website either. So you can tell them to look you up on Facebook, they can contact you, and you can offer in order for them to call you, or even a video session. And that is one of the best ways in order to get a feel for who the person is. If they're polite, if if they're polite and everything goes well, then that's perfect. That's somebody you're going to probably get along well with and live with. On the other side of the coin, if you talk to them and they're kind of rude and abrupt and not very respectful, you get an idea of how those 3 months are going to go, and it might not be the best place for you in order to stay. Those are the big tips. You can, because we are in a situation living somewhere so long for 3 months, once you get comfortable with the person, if you're staying in their home, or if you're just renting out their condo and you have the whole place to yourself, you have both options with Airbnb that you can offer, and maybe approach them on the side and be like, hey, do you mind if I just pay you directly? Because the Airbnb fee is going to be higher than just paying them directly. And so usually the fee on their end isn't very high. I found out it's usually only about like $10. For us, it's about $300 to $400, depending on where you're staying, and for the whole entire stay that you're staying there for 3 months. So it's really beneficial for you if you are comfortable with that. If they are comfortable with that and you can work out a deal, that would be very good in order for you to save a little extra cash. I wouldn't try to do this before you move in, just because you don't know what that situation is going to be. So this is definitely something that you want to do with somebody that you're comfortable with, because once you move the middleman out of it, Airbnb, now if there's any problems arise that later come up and you're nervous, you don't have that person to kind of support you, and they don't have that person to support them as well if anything were to happen during your stay, or any grievances come up while you're staying there. Last thing is that Airbnb, although I believe it is the most convenient option out there, it is not the cheapest. And so if you are okay with living in somebody's home and renting out a room, it is one of the cheaper options. There's also Craigslist, which I would argue is probably cheaper than Airbnb because there's not a fee associated with it. But if you were looking for housing just on your own to have a whole place to yourself, it is definitely not the cheapest way to go. But it is the most convenient. You get to go on the app, you get to look at ratings, you get to see a general area where they'll be living at. You get to message people and get a feel for them, and again, invite them outside the app to have a conversation if you're nervous about it. And it is just really easy. You look up the area and there's so many options, especially if you're if you're in California or near a city, there's going to be so many different options for you. It's going to be so convenient for you to find a place that's going to work for you. But again, it's not going to be the cheapest option. But if you are comfortable with that, living in somebody's home, definitely both have pros and cons. If you're living in somebody's home, you get to make a new friend. You get to meet them and learn their culture and just have an extra person to tell you what to do on the weekends when you don't know what to do, about good hiking, about hole-in-the-wall spots that you otherwise wouldn't have found. So there's those pros. And then obviously with the staying at a place on your own, the pros are having the whole entire place to yourself. And a lot of those worries about maybe not meshing well with a roommate kind of go away if you're not staying with somebody as well. But it's all just preference. I enjoy both. Both have their big pros. I like to do a little bit of mix every now and then. So definitely something to think about. But yeah, those are my big three things that I learned from Airbnb. One, the charges are kind of sneaky and they get you at the end. Two, message everyone. It's very convenient. But three is probably not the cheapest. One last remark on using Airbnb. As with any housing, you want to look at very carefully the cancellation policy, because if you're going to be staying there 3 months, but they require you a 2-month cancellation policy, and that's longer than the cancellation that you have within your contract, you might end up in the hole if your contract cancels early and you have an extra 30 days that you technically owe for the Airbnb. Most that I've seen have been a 2-week cancellation policy and a 30-day cancellation policy. So just make sure that the cancellation policies of the Airbnb app or whatever housing situation that you are using matches up with the cancellation policy that you have within your contract. That way you don't end up in the hole, which is one of the biggest ways that people get into a kind of a financial blunder when doing medical contracting, is that they get canceled on because they only had a 2-week cancel notice. And then they ended up having a 30-day cancellation notice for their housing. And then now they owe that extra amount of days for the housing situation, and there's no way that you can get out of it. So those are my big things, guys. If you have not used Airbnb yet, I am posting a link down below that you can access in the show notes that will get you $40 off your first using of the app. So go to newmedicalnomads.com. You can find this episode there. Once you find it, check out the show notes. I'll put the Airbnb link there. Again, it'll get you $40 off if you've never used Airbnb before. But that is something that is going to help you guys out. I'm all about you and building this community as listeners. This podcast, if you see it, comment, like. The more engagement we get, the more people will see it, which is ultimately the goal of this group, is to help other travelers out there. If you are looking for the next episode of the podcast, go to New Medical Nomads Podcast Facebook page. If you want to join the group, New Medical Nomads group, you can post any questions in there about Airbnb or other housing questions as well. And as always, guys, safe travels.